February 28, 2026. The sirens were screaming over Tel Aviv before dawn. The sky above the Mediterranean coast filled with streaks of light, trails of fire cutting through the darkness like a burning ledger falling from the sky. Most people watching those images thought they understood what they were seeing. They thought this was about missiles, drones, and military pride. They were wrong. This was not primarily a military event. It was a financial reckoning, decades in the making. Strip away the explosions, the speeches, and the flags, and what remains is a balance sheet so deeply broken that war became the only language left. This is the story of how two economies, chained together by oil, sanctions, and geopolitical debt, collided in the skies above Tel Aviv. Think about that for a moment. Wars do not begin with missiles. They begin in budget rooms, in treasury halls, in the quiet offices where numbers are entered and crossed out. By February 2026, both Iran and Israel had been running deficits that were not just financial, but strategic. They were both bleeding. They were both drowning. And drowning nations do desperate things. Let us rewind. Let us go back to when Iran looked invincible. In the early 2000s, Iran sat on the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet and the fourth largest proven oil reserves in the world. The economy was not merely surviving, it was expanding. Tehran's bazaars moved billions of dollars in goods each year. The rial, though never a global currency, held its internal value with quiet confidence. Iran's GDP was climbing towards $600 billion, and the government was funding its entire regional ambition on the back of oil revenues touching $80 per barrel. The Revolutionary Guard, the proxy networks, the missile programs, the nuclear facilities, all of it was paid for by one thing: black gold. The resource beneath the sand was not just energy. It was the entire financial architecture of the Iranian state. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. The addiction began long before the missiles flew. Iran's fatal economic flaw was not its military posture. It was its complete and total dependency on petroleum revenues to fund every single function of the state. When oil prices moved, Iran bled. When sanctions tightened, Iran choked. The economy was not a diversified machine. It was a single artery, and the world had its fingers wrapped around that artery. Sanctions became the silent assassin. Think of sanctions not as political pressure, but as a financial tourniquet applied to a nation's jugular. By 2018, when the United States reimposed sweeping sanctions under CAATSA and the JCPOA withdrawal, Iran's oil exports collapsed from 2.5 million barrels per day to under 400,000 barrels per day. Let that number sink in. That is an 84% collapse in the country's primary revenue source within 24 months. The antagonist in this story is not a general. It is the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, known simply as OFAC. This quiet, bureaucratic office, staffed by lawyers and economists, not soldiers, had effectively conducted a financial siege of an entire nation. OFAC did not fire a single bullet. It did not need to. By 2020, Iran's rial had lost over 60% of its value in 3 years. Inflation inside Iran hit 47% in 2021, then surged to 52% in 2022. The price of basic goods, bread, cooking, oil, medicine, doubled, and then doubled again. Ordinary Iranians, people who had no connection to any government policy, were paying the price. The ledger had turned against them, and the ledger does not care about children or families. Iran's government responded the only way a cornered economy can respond. It printed money. The Central Bank of Iran pumped liquidity into the system to keep the government machinery running. But printing money without economic output is not stimulus. It is a slow poison. Inflation spiraled further. The purchasing power of the average Iranian household collapsed by approximately 30% between 2018 and 2024 alone. The insolvency was not theoretical. It was visible in the streets. Now look at the other side of the ledger. Israel, by contrast, appeared to be an economic marvel. By 2025, Israel's GDP had reached approximately $560 billion, a staggering number for a nation of just 9.5 million people. Its technology sector, the so-called Startup Nation engine, was generating billions in foreign investment annually. Companies like Mobileye, Checkpoint, and hundreds of defense tech startups made Israel a financial powerhouse on paper. But Israel was also hemorrhaging cash. The military campaign in Gaza that began in October 2023 had, by mid-2025, cost the Israeli economy an estimated $55 billion in direct military expenditure and indirect economic losses. Tourism revenues collapsed. Foreign investment began to slow. The credit rating agency Moody's downgraded Israel's sovereign debt rating in February 2024, a moment that passed with little fanfare but spoke volumes. Moody's does not care about politics. Moody's only reads the ledger. Israel's defense budget had been stretched to nearly 8% of GDP by 2025, a figure not seen since the early 1980s. The Iron Dome, David Sling, and the Aero systems together cost billions of dollars to operate and reload. Each Iron Dome interception costs approximately $50,000 to $100,000 per missile fired. Each Aero 3 interception of a ballistic threat costs an estimated $2 to $3.5 million per shot. Now multiply that by hundreds of incoming projectiles in a single night. You are looking at a bill measured not in millions, but in billions in a single evening. Think about the scale of that. A single wave of Iranian drones and missiles, even if 90% are intercepted, costs the defending nation hundreds of millions of dollars in ammunition alone. The attacker spends far less. A Shahed-136 drone costs Iran approximately $20,000 to manufacture. A Fateh-110 ballistic missile costs between $500,000 and $1 million. Iran floods the sky with cheap weapons, and Israel spends vastly more to destroy them than Iran spent to build them. This is not just military strategy. This is financial warfare. The economic logic is brutal and precise. The descent did not happen overnight. It was a slow spiral, a tightening noose, a ledger losing one entry at a time. Trace the timeline carefully. In 2018, the JCPOA collapsed and Iran's financial isolation deepens dramatically. By 2021, Iran's foreign currency reserves had dropped to approximately $4 billion, compared to over $100 billion in accessible reserves before sanctions. $100 billion effectively vanished from the Iranian balance sheet in less than a decade. Gone. Iran's response was to accelerate its regional proxy strategy, funding Hezbollah, funding Hamas, funding Houthi networks across Yemen. All of this was not ideological charity. It was strategic investment. Iran was building a military deterrence network on the cheap because it could no longer afford a full conventional military contest. The proxy army was the economically efficient alternative to a $500 billion defense budget Iran simply did not have. By late 2024, Iran had enriched uranium to 84% purity, one step below weapons grade. The IAEA reported stockpiles of enriched uranium that exceeded all civilian energy justifications. The nuclear program which costs Iran an estimated $5 to $7 billion annually to maintain, was becoming the most expensive line item on a budget that was already in cardiac arrest. Iran was betting its last financial chips on achieving a deterrence posture before the money completely ran out. In late February 2026, Israel struck. The operation targeted Iranian military infrastructure, missile production facilities, and nuclear adjacent sites deep inside Iranian territory. It was the most aggressive direct action ever taken by Israel inside Iran's borders. The cost of that operation, in terms of munitions, logistics, and intelligence assets deployed, is estimated by analysts at between $8 billion and $12 billion. Israel essentially wrote a massive check and hoped the message was received. Iran read the message differently. This is the smoking gun moment. Not a document, not a treaty, but a number. Pa? On the morning of March 1st, 2026, inside a hardened military command center outside Tehran, Iranian military leadership convened a session that lasted 11 hours. The financial briefing was delivered first, before any military assessment. Iran's liquid foreign currency reserves had fallen to approximately $3.2 billion. The monthly costs of running Iran's military operations, domestic security, and subsidies to prevent civil unrest was running at $4.8 billion per month. Iran was, by any honest financial reckoning, technically insolvent. The balance sheet had flatlined. The decision to launch was not purely military. It was an act of financial desperation dressed in military costume. A nation that cannot afford to absorb another strike without triggering internal collapse has very few options. The generals understood this. The economists in the room understood this even better. The counterattack was not strength. It was the last move of a cornered debtor. Sovereignty is solvency. When the money runs out, the options run out with it. The wave of Iranian attacks that struck Israel in late February and early March of 2026 involved an estimated 300 to 400 projectiles launched in coordinated waves over a 72-hour period. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hundreds of short-variant drones. Israel's air defense systems performed at extraordinary levels. Approximately 85 to 90% of incoming projectiles were but the remaining 10% still reached their targets. The financial toll on Israel was savage. In 3 days of intensive interception and counterattack operations, Israel's Ministry of Finance estimated expenditure between $14 billion and $18 billion in direct military costs. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange suspended trading twice. The shekel fell 9% against the dollar in 4 trading sessions, its steepest drop since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. International insurance rates for cargo ships entering the eastern Mediterranean tripled overnight. Every insurance underwriter in London, Zurich, and New York was adjusting premiums in real time. The global economy flinched. Oil prices surged 31% in 72 hours when the attacks began. Brent crude went from $78 per barrel to over $102 per barrel in 3 days. For the world's largest oil importers, India, China, Japan, South Korea, Germany, this was a direct financial hit, landing in every fuel station, in every factory electricity bill simultaneously. The conflict had reached into the wallets of people in Mumbai and Seoul who had never heard a single siren. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, became the world's most dangerous financial nerve. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil passed through the strait every single day. That is roughly 21% of all global oil consumption. When Iranian naval forces began conducting warning maneuvers near the strait in early March 2026, global shipping companies began the cost of rerouting a supertanker around the Cape of Good Hope instead of through the strait adds approximately $2 million to $3 million per voyage. Multiply that by hundreds of tankers per week. The ledger was burning on a global scale. The United States was watching the numbers with a cold, calculating eye. Washington had already allocated $14.5 billion in emergency military aid packages to Israel since October 2023. By March 2026, that cumulative number had crossed $38 billion. The U.S. Congress was divided not on ideology alone, but on economics. The Congressional Budget Office had quietly flagged that continued Middle East military assistance was adding pressure to an already strained federal balance sheet. America's own national debt had crossed $37 trillion. Every billion sent to the Middle East was a billion borrowed from the future. The internal American debate was not about whether Israel had the right to defend itself. It was about whether the United States could afford to keep writing the check. Because there is a point where even the world's largest economy has to look at its own ledger and make a decision. That point was getting uncomfortably close. Western financial markets told the honest story that politicians refused to tell publicly. Defense stocks surged. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman all saw share price increases between 12% and 19% in the first week of March 2026. The war economy was thriving, but simultaneously, consumer confidence indices in the European Union dropped to their lowest levels since the 2022 energy crisis. Bank of America's Global Fund Manager survey showed that 67% of institutional investors rated Middle East escalation as the single greatest near-term risk to global portfolio performance. The financial world was pricing in the very real possibility that this conflict would not end quickly. It rarely does. NATO's internal discussions, leaked through 3 separate European diplomatic channels, revealed a bloc deeply divided not on military principle, but on economic capacity. Germany, still navigating energy transition costs exceeding 500 billion, could not afford expanded military commitments. France, carrying public debt at 112% of GDP, was equally cautious. The alliance was united in statement and fractured in wallet. The speeches were bold. The balance sheets were terrified. And then there was Hezbollah. Israel's northern front opened simultaneously in late March 2026. Hezbollah, financed primarily through Iran to the tune of approximately $700 million to $800 million annually, began launching sustained rocket barrages into northern Israel. Kiryat Shmona, Nahariya, Safed. Towns along Israel's northern border faced bombardment that displaced approximately 150,000 civilians who had already been internally displaced since October 2023. The economic cost of sustained northern displacement, including emergency housing, lost agricultural production, and infrastructure damage, had already accumulated to over $9 billion since the conflict began. Israel was now in a two-front financial war. The National Emergency Declaration was not just a military posture. It was a budget declaration. Israel's emergency economic protocols activated reserve funds and unlocked emergency bond issuance authority. The Bank of Israel authorized the government to issue emergency sovereign bonds worth approximately 40 billion shekels, roughly $11 billion, to cover immediate military expenditure. The bond market absorbed them, but at elevated yields. Investors were willing to lend, but they wanted more interest. Debt was getting more expensive by the day. Here's the brutal, unglamorous truth that no general ever puts in a press conference. Modern warfare is not won by the bravest soldiers. It is won by the deepest pockets. And in this conflict, neither side had bottomless pockets. Iran was technically bankrupt. Israel was burning through emergency reserves at a pace that alarmed its own treasury officials. The United States was calculating political capital against financial cost in real time. And the global economy was absorbing shocks that would compound into inflation, debt, and lost growth for years, perhaps decades to come. The civilian casualties, the destroyed hospitals, the children in bomb shelters, these are the human face of what the ledger ultimately produces when it tips into insolvency. No missile program, no defense system, no geopolitical strategy survives contact with the reality that money is finite. Resources are finite, patience is finite, and the bill eventually comes due. The aftermath will stretch far beyond 2026. Economic historians studying comparable regional conflicts, the Iran-Iraq War of 1982-1988, the Lebanese Civil War, the Gulf War of 1991, note a consistent pattern. The direct military costs are dwarfed by the decade-long economic consequences. The Iran-Iraq War cost both nations a combined estimated $1.2 trillion in economic losses over its 8-year duration, equivalent to over $4 trillion in 2026 dollars. A generation of economic development was buried in the sand alongside the soldiers. If the 2026 Iran-Israel conflict continues at its current intensity for even 80 months, independent economic models project total regional losses, including disruption to oil markets, shipping, foreign investment, and civilian infrastructure, at between $800 billion and $1.4 trillion. These are not abstract numbers. They are years of schools not built, hospitals not equipped, and generations not educated. Iran will not recover quickly. Its economy, already running on fumes by early 2026, will face post-conflict reconstruction costs estimated between $120 billion and $180 billion, at a time when its access to international capital markets remains effectively frozen by sanctions. The rial, already a shadow of its former self, will lose further ground. The middle class that survives sanctions will be further hollowed out. The brain drain, which had already cost Iran approximately 150,000 skilled professionals per year before the conflict, will accelerate dramatically. Israel will pay its own long price. The emergency bonds issued in March 2026 will need to be repaid over 10 to 20 years. The debt-to-GDP ratio, previously a source of Israeli pride at under 62%, is projected to cross 80% within 3 years of sustained conflict. The technology investment that made Israel a regional economic marvel will slow. Venture capital does not thrive under missile sirens. The startup nation engine will stall, and the world will absorb the rest. The lesson of this conflict is not written in the ruble of missile strikes or in the heroism of soldiers on either side. It is written in the spreadsheets of treasury departments from Washington to Beijing, in the quarterly reports of global oil companies, in the mortgage statements of ordinary families who will pay higher energy prices for years. because two nations decided that war was cheaper than compromise. It was not cheaper. It never is. History has never produced a war that cost less than the peace that could have preceded it. Not once. Not in 1,000 years of recorded conflict. The ledger always tells the same story in the end. The gold runs out, the credit freezes, the allies pull back, and what remains is a bill that the next generation must pay with interest. What you witness in the skies above Tel Aviv in February and March of 2026 was not a military triumph or defeat. It was a financial crisis wearing a military uniform. It was two economies too broken to negotiate and too proud to surrender, colliding in the most expensive way possible.